Welcome everybody to this very promising to very interesting talk. My name is Morten Slutter. I'm the chair of the Department of Religious Studies, and I really want to welcome Dr. Yanitza Buendía de Llaca. She is a scholar of Latinx and indigenous religious practices, and in her work as an ethnographer and historian of religion, she has focused on the traditions and practices behind the public performance of Aztec dance. Through a hemispheric view of religions, Dr. Buendía de Llaca studies religions that fluctuate from indigenous traditions to Latin American New Age. She received her PhD from the University of California in Santa Barbara in 2021. So welcome, Yanitza. We're very happy to have you here, and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm very excited to be able to present my research. The talk is a little bit long, so please feel free to stop me when we have reached the 40 minutes if I'm still going and going. And I'll be able to summarize or resume wherever we're at, but hopefully we'll have time for everything. And before I start, I just want to recognize that thanks to technology, it's very interesting to think about how we can be in the same territory, but at the same time in very different occupied lands. So I want to honor the fact that I am in northern Chumash land, Yaktitituk, and I would love if someone can help me in the chat honor and acknowledge the land that you are listening this talk from. So I'm going to share my screen. I almost started without sharing. And the first thing that I'm going to show you is a video. Can you all see my screen, hopefully? Thank you. I'm not going to share the sound, and I'm going to start this video around minute 15. It's a documentary that was done in Mexico in the 1960s. And I can give you more of the information of this later at the end of the talk. So in 1965, Mexican anthropologists Guillermo Bonfil Batalla and Arturo Warmer, alongside with documentarists Alfonso Muñoz and Victor Anteneo, produced a documentary where Aztec dancers became not just the protagonists, but also the endless objects of study of anthropologists and sociologists specialized in indigenous peoples from Mexico. Who are these men? Asked the narrator of the documentary. Are these quote unquote real Indians, or are these quote unquote mestizo restorationists? Asked a decade after the documentary, American anthropologist Judith Friedlander. These questions about defining these people have for a long time intrigued scholars that classify people through the lens of authenticity. Are these real Indians? My research moves away from this question to instead engage with the history and the everyday practice of people from Mexico that through family histories and oral history are trying to reconnect to their indigenous roots by practicing dance and performing ceremonies. I argue that there is a body-text connection that through ritual activity has allowed Mesoamerican traditions not just to survive, but to thrive in these disenfranchised communities, both in Mexico and in the United States. In this talk, I'm going to be sharing a little bit about my research in Toltec and Aztec revitalization movements. I will give you a historical overview, and then I'm going to share with you like what are the questions that brought me to look to do an ethnography around this movement. And then if we have time, I'll share with you a little bit about my future research, and hopefully we'll have time to have a discussion and also to answer some of your questions. So if you have questions and you cannot wait until the end, feel free to drop them in the chat. I might not be able to see them, but at the end, I'll be able to look again and summarize your questions to answer them. So my historical research is multi-sided, and it has me allowed to build this whole history around Toltec and Aztec revitalization movements. These topic can be found in other scholars with a different name, that is the Mexicayotl movement. But I use Toltec and Aztec revitalizations as an umbrella term that allows me to incorporate different groups that have created social and religious movements, and that all of them share the same intention and goal, that is to revitalize Toltec and or Aztec culture. I also use Toltec and Aztec for two reasons. One is to be inclusive, and the second one is to be faithful to the terms that people are using in the field, people that are engaging into these practices. Sometimes they would prioritize the name Toltec, and some of them would only use the term Aztec to describe what they're doing. One of the reasons why people prefer to use the term Toltec is because there are a lot of connotations, bad connotations that are associated to Aztec culture, specifically human sacrifice. So in a way to absolve themselves to this very complex and, well, it can be very hard for people to be associated with that. They use, or they decide to use the term Toltec instead. However, as I'm going to show you throughout this talk, it is actually Aztec culture, Aztec aesthetics, and Aztec history, the one that they're actually engaging with and the one that is being reproduced through all of these groups. And this is very logical also because we have a closer connection historically and geographically with the Aztecs than with the Toltecs. And by we, I mean we Mexicans from central Mexico, around Mexico City. So the Aztecs were the most powerful empire in this continent between 1428 and 1521. And this term Aztec is being used by historians to describe what was actually an alliance of three kingdoms or altepetls around what is today Mexico City. These were the kingdoms of Mexico, Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan. The Aztec Empire had a very complex social system with laws, architecture, science, and religion. And the Aztecs and the neighbor nations follow a very intricate calendar system that had in itself three different counts that were like the count of the years, the count of the months that would kind of like guide both agricultural practices and ceremonial practices. And then they have the divination calendar that would guide them like which symbol was associated per day. So this is a daily calendar that is called the Tonalpowali calendar, and I'm going to be talking about this later. In addition to all of this complexity, the Aztecs knew how to have fun. They were cool people. They had a lot of leisure activities. They had sports. They had games that they played, and they have dances. Aztec dance survived colonial disruption by two means, the text and the body. In the text form, there are descriptions of Spanish chronicles describing Aztec people dancing in circles, using the instruments and describing the motives of the dances. And through these documents, we know that Aztec dance was categorized generally in two types of dance: mitotilistli, that was the leisure dance, the fun dance, and masehualistli, that was the ritual dance, the one associated with religious practices. And then I was able to find records through my historical research of letters of what is now Mexican nationals communicating one another what's going on in the country, and them describing what they're seeing as mitotes. This is a word that we use in Spanish to describe something that is very disorganized. And these were actually dances that were still being practiced in 19th century by indigenous communities, indigenous peoples in Mexico, and that were separated from like the more hegemonic Mexican culture, or that seemed separated. So The other two periods that I'm going to talk to you about are periods that mark specifically these moments of revitalization after the disruption of the Aztec Empire. The first moment that we're going to see in the early 20th century is going to be after the Mexican Revolution of 1910, when indigenous people around what is today Mexico City were pushed to be part of this urban landscape. And there are two things that happen that allow indigenous people to be visible in this urban landscape. The first one is the internal mobility that happened after the Mexican Revolution, when indigenous people didn't have lands anymore that they were able to use for agricultural purposes. So they moved to the city to look for industrial jobs. And the other thing is that the boundaries, the borders of the city are being pushed around. So what was Mexico City is getting amplified, and what was an indigenous town is now part of this huge, crazy city that we have today. So middle-class Mexicans that were unaccustomed to seeing indigenous people performing their indigeneity became all of a sudden aware that these people existed, that they were around them, and that they were not part of this hegemonic Mexican culture. And while new generations of mestizos grew, they also encountered all these movements that started to try to revitalize Aztec culture. First, through a linguistic revitalization. There are very specific moments where these linguistic revitalizations happen. There's a whole history that happens around the town of Tláhuac, where some of the first grammars are created. And the second one is through the performances that we're seeing, through these dance practices, these ritual practices that are being done outside of Catholic churches, and that are positioning indigenous peoples as also public figures of these new urban spaces. These first dances that we're seeing, dancers, in this early 20th century are part of what we know today, or we call today, the conchero movement. A movement that was a syncretic movement and that mix Catholic religion with indigenous practices. And I know that in religious studies, the term syncretic can be very problematic, but right now is the easiest way that we have to describe this type of practices, because conchero dancers are actually Catholic practitioners that do incorporate indigenous religious and indigenous practices that other Catholic practitioners would not incorporate. The second period I want you to know, or that I want to talk about, so I'm going to move the transcripts a little bit so that you can see, is the 1960s. The 1960s was very important for Toltec and Aztec revitalizations, first because through the creation of one movement that is called the Mexicayotl movement, things change. The founders of the Mexicayotl movement are Rodolfo Nieva Lopez and Maria del Carmen Nieva Lopez, and they created this movement of revitalization that has been, up to today, the most popular movement of Toltec and Aztec revitalizations. And that's why a lot of scholars use just the Mexicayotl movement as the name to describe everything. But what I'm trying to do in my research is to position historically the difference between the Mexicayotl movement, the other movements that are around it, and what we can see today as an umbrella term. So the Nievas, this family, published different books reappropriating Mesoamerican history. They also created classes to teach the Aztec calendar and Aztec history, and Nahuatl, the indigenous language. And they also reinserted the structure of the Calpulli. Calpulli is the name that was given in the Aztec Empire to kind of like the smallest organization. And it was similar to what we know as a neighborhood. It's like the kind of like the equivalency of a neighborhood. And you will see, like, if you go into the history of these Toltec and Aztec revitalizations, people that practice the groups, they're going to call their groups Calpullis, and it is thanks to these people. But despite all the efforts that the Mexicayotl movement was doing to revitalize cultures, there was something that was missing in their movement, and that was dance. So they have the philosophical and the linguistic revitalization, but the conchero dancers have the dance and the ritual. So I started wondering, why was this separate and how did this merge together? Because today practitioners have both things. They do both things together. It's not a separate thing. And through oral histories, I was able to find out a moment when Maria del Carmen Nieva came to the School of Journalists in Mexico City to talk to the concheros and say, let's join forces. I'll teach philosophy and calendar, you'll teach dance. And since this moment, that was in the 1980s, the movement changed completely to what we see today, to what we know today. So today, many practitioners of Toltec and Aztec revitalization could not imagine that this duo of body and text were different movements before this moment. Another thing happened in the 1960s. Between the 1960s and the 1980s, there was a boom and explosion of best-selling literature. And you may recognize some of the titles here. You cannot see it very well, but if I tell you the authors and the title of these books, you might be able to recognize it. So one of them is The Teachings of Don Juan by Carlos Castaneda. This was published first in English by the University of California Press in 1965, and it became a best-selling novel that up to many people buy and read. And the other one you might not be as familiar with because it's a best-selling novel from Mexico, but if someone is from Mexico, you will know this book. And this is Regina, 2 de Octubre no se olvida by Antonio Velasco Piña. This best-selling literature caught the attention of spiritual seekers in Mexico. Mexican groups that were already reading things like the Bhagavad Gita and Madame Blavatsky turn around to see their own world, their own culture, their context, and embrace indigenous past as a new spiritual path. In addition to the 1960s best-selling boom, we also see that in the United States, there is the civil rights movements where Chicano and Chicanas gain a new political identity. Aztec dancers came to the United States around this time as well, and Aztec dance emerged as part of the search of identity for Chicanos and Chicanas and a way for them to connect with indigeneity. There is not a single historical moment where we can trace like this is the first dancer that came to the United States, but we know through interviews that there were conchero teachers coming to the United States in the early 70s to join the Chicano movement and dance as part of the protests as well. So one of the most complex things about Toltec and Aztec revitalizations is that their history is alive. So I've pinpointed like historical moments that are important for me and for historians of these movements to understand where is this coming from, but the reality is that all of them are alive. So there are conchero movements today that practice just conchero dance, and there are people that just do the revitalization of languages and that they're working in creating new grammars or dictionaries. And there is at the same time this new other movement with the Mexicayotl and that are mixing and trying to create these body text connection. So I just want you to, with this chart, be aware of like where the group that I did my field work is positioned. Oh, sorry. So if you see here, like is the concheros, the revitalization of language and culture. And here you're gonna see the Mexicayotl movement with the Nieva family. And then from that Mexicayotl movement, I dropped down and we're going to see this new group that is called the Masehuales. And that is the group that I work with in Chicago. And all of this is super interesting, but I'm not going to talk about it today. So while I was studying this history of the Mexicayotl movement and observing dancers in public spaces, I started questioning how is this history like connected to indigenous identities? What are the practices that are they, what are these practices make them connect with? How is this reclamation of indigenous identity or not? And how are these practices connected to their everyday lives? Are these connected to an everyday life, or this is something that is being done in the moment and then forgotten about? So my ethnography was done in Pilsen, Chicago. And if you've ever been to that city and you've ever seen Pilsen, it's very impressive, like you feel you're in Mexico. And this has been a Mexican neighborhood for the last 60 years. And this institute where I did all my ethnographic work was like in the center of Pilsen, Chicago, 2 blocks from the institute. We had like 18th Street and the train for Entrance Street, and like 2 blocks on the other side, you have the Mexican, where am I? I'm so sorry. The Museum of Mexican Art. That is one of the few institutes that has only and exclusively Mexican art and Chicano art in the country. So I'm going to call this Institute Malinali. This is an anonymous name that I chose to keep outsiders outside of the space and the teacher and the students. And Malinali is the 12th sign of the Tonalpowali calendar, and it symbolizes grass that is grown already. So it's like a symbol of fertility. Also note that throughout my research, I used a different spelling for Chicago. I used the X, Chicago, to simulate this Mexicana spelling and sound that many places have around Mexico. And to me, it was also like a way of making it more real, how Mexican and how now indigenous these spaces are. So people that come to this space are usually student practitioners, and they engage by registering to classes. But sometimes the space is also open to the general public, and they come for different types of events like public lectures or some ceremonies that are open to the public, and sometimes some type of performances. And they use the term Toltec. So they would say like their institute is an institute for Toltec wisdom. They are not using the word Aztec. So Malinali's curricula is very extensive, and I divided what they teach into 2 categories: the physical disciplines that are dance, archery, warrior discipline, that is Yautilistli, and then you have the non-physical disciplines that are the disciplines of study, right? That are the Tonalpowali, this is the Aztec calendar, some classes of like meditation that they are called Eje. This meditation is very different from the type of meditation we see in other traditions because it uses the symbols and a lot of the history of Mesoamerican past. And then sometimes they have classes of semiotics, drumming, chanting, etc. that are less common, less rigorous as well. From all of these classes, Tonalpowali calendar and dance, that is called here Masewalistli, are the 2 classes that have different levels. You have a beginner's level, and then you have what they call a committed level. It's not advanced, it's committed. And although I'm going to talk only about 2 of these, I just want you to be aware that all of them exist. So I'm going to focus on dance and Tonalpowali because they're the best examples that I have to create this argument of body and text that we're seeing, but I could do it with selecting other classes and the results will be very similar. However, these are the most popular, and this is what we're going to see also in other groups of Toltec and Aztec revitalization movements, dance and Tonalpowali text. So Danza Masewalistli has 2 levels, the beginners and the committed. And usually the beginners class is open to the public, and they have like a great way of publicizing in their website and social media to keep active with like new students and welcome new students to the class. However, there's something different happening in this group from other Toltec and Aztec revitalization movements, and that is that all dancers, independently of their level of dance experience, even if they dance in a concerto group before this or a different Aztec dance, they have to start in the beginner's level, and they are removed of all their regalia. So some of these dancers, you're going to see them dance with like hairdressers or ankle rattles that have also a sound. And here, like, they're stripped of all regalia and they have to start in the beginner's level and be equal as their other peers. And this is very intentional. And the other interesting thing that we're going to see is that although these classes are mainly like physical, there is a ritual that contains the practice. So at the beginning and at the end of the class, we're going to see that they start and end with different chants that are done in Nahuatl. And there's also a small altar that is put in the middle of the circle to symbolize the center, and that a student practitioner is in charge of putting, depending on like their level of commitment. During my fieldwork, I interview different student practitioners from different levels to see how danza was being perceived and how they incorporated this practice, and how they were also creating an identity that was both religious and racial through these practices. So, and I'm going to explain why it's both in just a little bit. So during my time in Linali, I also witnessed different moments in which different dances were practiced, and there was an explicit effort from the teacher to distinguish himself and his institute from other Mexicayotl dances, other Aztec dances. And I thought this was very interesting to observe. So this is one example of one of the discourses that he was saying, right? And this is why this dance is different and why it's so important to understand. So he says, like, dance brings a lot of benefits of self-knowledge. Not all dances have this effect. And when he says like not all dances, he's not referring to just like dancing like salsa or Zumba. He's talking about Aztec dance. Not all Aztec dances have this effect. There are people that dance and they are just doing the movement without the internal work, and that is not danza masehual. So danza masehual is the one that is going to make student practitioners gain this knowledge. The physical attributes of the exercise are important, but it's also as important a spiritual and psychological connection and attributes that practitioners are going to generate through this movement. In addition, my research is also going to analyze this multi-layered way in which practitioners engage with this discipline. I have one example of how one student, I'm calling her Sola, is talking about how for her danza was not just about self-knowledge, but it was also about self-healing. So she told me, when I was 9, I had this experience that was very traumatizing, and it kind of made me avoid my body. Like cualquier cosa que sentía, everything that I felt, I would run away from it. So in high school, I never joined any sports because like I didn't want to feel my body, you know? And then I wasn't until I joined danza that I understood why I was running away from my own body. I knew that for me to get to the place where I wanted to be, I was to create a relationship with my body. I knew that being active and seeking a discipline that like really made me connect with my body is what I was needed. So we can see here how for Sola, connecting with her body was not going to happen by chance. It is through this discipline that she knows she's able to create a reflection about how danza masehualistli is the practice that is creating this, in this case, self-healing process. So danza Masegualistli is a discipline that is entangled with self-healing, as we just saw, ritual, and also identity. The name by itself provides us a hint on how this identity is being formed through practice. Masegualistli, which is the bodily practice, is connected also with the word Masegual. Maseguales in the Aztec Empire were the bottom of the pyramid in the social stratification. Maseguales were also the dancers of Masegualistli dance, the ritual dance. For Maseguales today, at Malinali, being a Masegual is an identity that is always in formation and that is entangled with being a practitioner and a dancer. This identity is trying to create a connection also with their ancestors and what they see as like this new person that they're trying to be. It's an achieving identity. They're trying to achieve this. It's very similar in the Aztec Empire what Maseguales need to do. Maseguales work to deserve their positionality, and nothing was given to them. As mentioned by Sola in an interview, danza also has these healing capacities, and it is through the movement of the body, the music, the chants, and the performance in general that student practitioners can acquire this connection with their bodies and convert these not just into a physical discipline, but something that is part of their identities. At Malinali as well, and we're gonna see this in some Toltec and Aztec revitalization movements outside of Malinali, it's interesting how we see the connection of Aztec dance with other type of disciplines. So usually like inside dance classes, they're gonna learn also Nahuatl chants, they're gonna learn music. And there's also like a speeches that the teacher is going to give when there are moments of pause, when people are in between dances. And these speeches is the way that students learn symbolism and Mesoamerican philosophy. And I have an example here about like how these speeches have also, like students were expressing themselves about how these speeches were impacting them. So in this one, it's a part of my field work. So I put that Awad said that while danza classes were physically challenging, they were also intellectually challenging and they were providing the push that she needed to learn to get better. In addition to danza being an integrative practice, it is common to see students registering to other classes as well. And we can see that this is almost like an interdisciplinary knowledge, right? So in this quote that I want to share from Julie, we're going to see how she's integrating both classes, the tonal powali class and the danza class, into one same knowledge that she's trying to understand. So she said, danza is a corporeal expression of tonal powali concepts. I get to see it actually in motion using my body. I'm learning how this earth and universe works and how it works within it, how I work within it. So similar to danza classes, tonal powali classes are going to have different levels. Sometimes in this one, we're gonna see 3 different levels of commitment for people. And just a little bit of background about the tonal powali. So as I mentioned earlier, the Aztecs used this calendar that had 3 different counts. And student practitioners that come to this class of the tonal powali are going to study one of these counts specifically. That is going to be the one of the day. That is going to be one day. It changes the symbol per day. Every 13 days, we're going to see a cycle. There is also another calendar that is being used, that is the 20-day calendar, the veintena, and this is going to be the marker of different ceremonial activities, but this one is not studied intellectually through the codices in the same way as the tonal powali calendar, and that's why I also marked the distinction between both of them. So Tonalpohualli classes are based on the study of these Mesoamerican codices, and historical research tells us that many Mesoamerican codices were destroyed with the Spanish conquest, and these codices used to be very complex and used to contain indigenous history, different counts, the system of tributes. It was like the IRS, and some of them were also just calendric systems. So the codices that they use to study the Tonalpohualli are this last calendric system that is going to talk about the days. And they all belong to what we know today as the Borgia group, even though they're different codices. And I put in this slide like the different codices that are part of the Borgia group. Usually the Borgia Codex, they have the same name, but they're different things. So one thing is like the group and the other one is the Borgia Codex that is part of the group. So the Borgia Codex, you can buy it on Amazon. It's very accessible. And this one is the one that is the most used because it's the clearest one and it's the most organized. The other codices, the Ferrier Marimeyer, Laud, and Vaticanus B are part of the Borgia group, and they're used sometimes to make comparisons in these classes, but they're not as organized as the Codex Borgia, and also they have a different aesthetics here and there. Two of them are available online if you ever want to browse around and just see how fun it is to look at them. You're not going to be able to understand them because they're super complex and they use pictographic language, which we don't know these days. But it's just fun to look them, to just look around. So during my research, I noticed that the student practitioners at Malenali and his teacher use these Tonalpohualli symbols to talk about their everyday lives and themselves. For example, one day we were just like walking around and one of the student practitioners told me that it was an Osomatli day. For me, in my Western calendar of time, for me, it was a Friday. It was just a Friday. For him, it was an Osomatli day. Osomatli is the symbol of the monkey. And he said that he couldn't go and grab a beer with us. We were going to go grab a beer. And he's like, no, I cannot go because it's Osomatli day. And I was like, why? What's wrong with Osomatli? And he's like, no, it's just that I don't react well in Osomatli days because I lose control more easily. So this way of them integrating the calendar into their personalities, their psyche, their behavior was very interesting. Similarly, the symbol of the Tonalpohualli are used to reflect about these behaviors with more general discourses. So in this class, for example, the teacher was talking about Kiahuitl, that is the symbol 19 of the Tonalpohualli and is represented by the rain. And he's saying, and I'm gonna read the quote, "A person who knows how to reign is not going to obstruct you, but rather redirect you. But what is the risk of being Kiahuitl? When a person doesn't know, it is too weak, impulsive, passionate, visceral. Or when a person is cold, insipid, immutable. A person who takes to the streets to start the revolution is too Kiahuitl. But if a person thinks there's nothing worth in life, and like, why bother do anything, then this person is cold and nothing will make the person react. So where is their self-will? The risk is not knowing how to focus. We all have extremes in our characters. The important thing is knowing how to be in the middle. Rain can be destructive. It can also be insufficient. So in this quote, we can see how nature is the protagonist, but the symbol of nature, and this is something that happened many, many times, is interpreted and used as something that we perceive that can be either way, that is actually reflecting something about the personality and the character of a human being. The study of the Tonalpohualli is done mainly through these codices that have symbols that are connected to nature, and that's why this discourse is this way. There are a lot of animals, plants, flowers, birds. This connection with nature is indicating usually of people's personality and reinforcing this creation of Masehual identity through embodied practices. In addition, the study of these codices is reconstructing a history of Mesoamerican history. And this is more complex. I'm not going to talk about how the reconstruction of history is done in here, but that's something that happens simultaneously. But one of the things that I want to talk about is that history is seen and understood as an accumulation of events that ultimately end in the individual. And that individual has a condition and a self that is done through this historical reinterpretation. By doing this, student practitioners are able to create a personality and gain forms that would identify themselves not as Mexican, but as indigenous peoples, and that would situate themselves in a time and a space where they had indigenous ancestors, and they're trying to create a different type of history that is connected to pride instead of shame or other attributes that historically have been attached to indigenous people. So a student of Malinali acquired different types of knowledge through dancing and through the study of texts. And all of these are going to be embodied knowledges that are incorporated into their everyday lives while they are in this construction process of identity. As I shown here, my ethnographic research talks about how practitioners of Toltec and Aztec revitalization movements combine embodied knowledges through dance and calendric systems in this example to keep Mesoamerican traditions alive. My research shows how this body-text connection has been crafted historically from separation to reunification. Aztec society had a body-text culture that was disrupted with colonialism. However, in the early 20th century, different groups of Toltec and Aztec revitalizations were able to unify this body-text duo through different ceremonial enactments. In addition, the creation of pedagogical spaces, and this is going to be the Calmecacs, are very important because it creates new generations of learners that are interpreting and reinterpreting Mesoamerican codices and history, and that are learning how to move their bodies and dance the same way as their ancestors used to do. Beyond the practice of dance, ritual, and ceremony, practitioners also are able to see the world different with these practices. Through calendric systems, they learn to reinterpret their everyday lives, the relationships that they have with people, their actions, and they see the world through a different lens that is not available to non-practitioners. In addition, by taking these classes, practitioners are learning a moral behavior and a belief system that is sustained by the community that is created in these same classes. Toltec and Aztec revitalization simply would not be able to exist today if it wasn't for the creation of classes and institutes all over Mexico and the United States that are reproducing these embodied knowledges and advancing this type of knowledge that used to be passed around through oral tradition in the family unit to the general public. And this is what has been able to create also a transnational movement that is important here in the United States and in Mexico. Today, we can see practitioners of Toltec and Aztec revitalization movement performing still their dances in public spaces, in public celebration, dancing with or without regalia, and challenging their double oppression as Mexican immigrants in the United States and as subjects that have been denied their indigeneity. So I want to touch really briefly on my future research if I have time. Do I have time? Yeah, cool. Okay. So I'm starting to think about what I want to do next. And I think that there is I love to say about this best-selling literature that has been produced both in the United States and Mexico since the teachings of Don Juan in 1965. And these best-selling literature authors and social media personalities too now, like TikTokers, Instagram, etc., they're contributing to the expression of Toltec and Aztec revitalization movements. And you might recognize some of these books. We have The Four Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz, who has attracted spiritual seekers from all ethnicities to, quote unquote, not take things personally. Or we also have more recently the autobiography of Xustecatl Martinez, who created a nonprofit organization, the Earth Guardians, and who spoke in 2015 in front of former President Barack Obama about his commitment with the environment as an indigenous activist in the United States. All of these books position Mexican indigeneity far from the reality of indigenous peoples in Mexico and Native American nations in the United States. Through a close reading, through a close analysis of these books, I want to see how these narratives are creating more social movements. I want to see how literature can also create social realities, and how these books are creating a new imaginaire of indigenous studies that is affecting Toltec and Aztec revitalization movements. So here's like the question that I have, that is, how is this bestseller authors are challenging and changing the imaginary of indigenous people, which I think is very important for us to start thinking, because these are books that are being consumed massively. So that's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for your patience. I'm looking forward to questions or discussion. If you want to just say something about this.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Really interesting. So any questions?
I'm curious to know if there are any students here today, undergrad students or grad students. I'm just curious.
I can see a couple of our grad students are here.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm an undergrad.
Awesome. Thank you, Ismail.
I'm a graduate student.
Thank you. Thank you. I see one question.
Can I go now?
Hi.
Yes, go ahead.
Yamista, is that correct pronunciation?
Janitza, it's okay.
Thank you so much. It was a really fascinating talk, and I truly enjoyed your presentation. And I have one minor question, and a little bit, second is a little bit kind of a comprehensive one. One is, in the first revitalization process, you mentioned linguistic revitalization and the first grammar created. Does it mean before then there was no like a grammar for indigenous languages, and then just they started to create things? So that part is kind of curious, because to me, language is a really critical part of any kind of a national revitalization. So any comment would be really appreciated. My second question is a little bit kind of a bigger, and I'm still trying to figure out how to say it. But while listening to your talk, I was thinking of maybe your project could be understood as a part of the decolonizing process in response to colonial, neo-colonial histories we had. So there are a lot of some histories of indigenous groups suppressed, dismissed, or undervalued for a long time. So this type of revitalization could be understood as a way to elicit and kind of excavate those indigenous roots and meanings, and give new name and new values, and etc. So to me, in this kind of decolonizing process may have two components. One is resistance to colonial histories. But more importantly, it could be part of a transformation of perspectives by bringing in new histories and a new way of being. When you mention dance, for example, when people dance, danza, self-healing, but also people feel body, earth, universe. So it's not just a human-centered, anthropocentric kind of thing. It's a very comprehensive, bringing all this, embracing all these matters, and also how to be in the middle. Again, this is also against the capitalistic mentality that is like the bigger the better kind of things. So I'm just wondering if you could comment on how your project might be related to kind of an ongoing decolonizing project by many scholars and activists.
Thank you. So these are two big questions, but so there for the first question about the grammars in Nahuatl, right? Like there were, since the Spanish chronicles, like they're not quite grammars, but they're books that explain the Nahuatl language. But it's all to understand the indigenous population through the lens of a Spanish colonial project. And what is different of the grammars that are being created in the 1920s is that for the first time we see indigenous people without the supervision of a Spanish colonial project creating new grammars for the people, for their towns. And Nahuatl, we say Nahuatl as a one language, but really Nahuatl is a linguistic family. And there are so many variations in Nahuatl. So for example, the people that were doing their grammar in Tláhuac would not be able to use that grammar if they go to Veracruz, to the Huastec region of Mexico. So I think that's something important also, because it's like for the first time they're like taking their own language and trying to also use the Spanish phonetics and the Spanish alphabet, the Western alphabet that we have, to create these grammars and dictionaries for the town and the people. There were more dictionaries than grammars before this, I would say. Yeah, it's different, right? And yes, thank you for your second question. It's very complicated for me to talk about decolonization and the colonial project. So one of the problematic things that I would say we're seeing with this type of Toltec and Aztec revitalization movements is that, yes, they are creating a history of resistance of colonial projects, like you were saying, that there's no way of denying that. And they are creating new ways of being that are also in the context of decolonization. However, most of them and all of them in the United States are guests, are in occupied lands. And there is no reflection of this. And there is also like a layer that can be problematized about being of indigenous descent and being indigenous, right? So who is able to claim an indigenous identity and why, to what purposes? So claiming an indigenous identity to be able to have a ritual, to be able to have, to be able to be a better person, to have self-knowledge. I mean, it's great, like it's not damaging anyone, but we have seen so many times in this country, people claiming indigenous identities to get the Ford Fellowship or to have academic appointments, right? So that can be problematic. I am very fortunate that I have not seen that happening in the groups that I work with. They have been very respectful. And the other thing that we're seeing with decolonization is that the project of decolonization is a project to giving the land back to indigenous people. And when you are seeing immigrant communities that are also being pushed away from their lands, it's very, where do you decolonize what? It's very complex. There's no one answer or one easy solution to this, right? So colonization happens like in 2 layers, I feel, and this type of colonization through ritual and identity, I feel it's the most superficial level. And it's a level that it's also apolitical, that is not engaging with the political needs of indigenous communities. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yanitza, this is such exciting work. Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm really intrigued by your last answer, which crystallizes a question that was kind of coming up for me as you were talking, which is, the real politics of decolonization with dealing with land is something that I feel like there's quite a bit of scholarship about, but I haven't heard scholarship about decolonization by dealing with time.
Yes.
Decolonizing our temporalities. And that may be my own ignorance in the field, but I'm curious if you could talk about what this particular attention to calendrical systems adds to our thinking about the scholarship on and the work of decolonizing.
Thank you. That's really interesting, and I love it because one of the things that I wrote when I was doing this work in my dissertation is that when I was imagining the use of the calendric systems, right? I was seeing like, well, the Aztecs were cartographers of 2 worlds. The Aztecs were cartographers of the land because they had amazing maps. They were the only documents that were not burned by the Spanish conquistadors were the maps, because they were used to go further and further, right? Like they were the useful ones, but they were cartographers of the land, and they were also cartographers of the sky. It's impressive. It's so amazing what they were doing and how they were counting all of the stars, and they were very aware of the transits of like Venus and the moon. And again, the people I work with, they don't like comparing this with astrological signs or with astrology. But if we think of astrology as a like more complex time, like some people like would say that you get affected by like so many things, like the sun, the moon, right? Like it's not just the one sign. And in that sense, it is very similar. It is very similar. And this idea of decolonizing time, I think it's very important because it's still a little bit apolitical, but it's above the first superficial level, I feel like, of the colonization, because it's not telling you just who you are through like practices. It's kind of like telling you who you are in relationship with the rest of the world, a little bit like what the first question was also indicating, that it's very complex, and it's kind of like united and entangled with nature, the world, or like your community as well. And it's very interesting because one thing that I did observe with them is that they do not use religion, and this is something that I caught because of time, but I have like a whole discussion about like why are they not using the word religion? How can we as scholars of religious studies incorporate this in our analysis? But there was this one instance when they were actually appropriating the word religion for their own purposes. And that is during the shift of the year, when there's like the Aztec New Year. It is 5 days of very intense ceremony with fasting. And some people wanted to have those days for themselves and not have to go to work, to be all the time in temple, in ceremony, fasting. And that was the one time that they used letters to be able to ask for the right of their First Amendment, to have their religious freedom to participate in their ceremonies in the shift of the year, because it always changes in the calendar, and sometimes it's like Monday to Thursday, sometimes it's Thursday to like it's right. So that's a yeah, and it's connected with time. Mhm. Thank you.
Could I ask a question that's so, you know, when you hear about other sort of Native American sort of spiritual traditions being revived, you see it as a sort of way of reclaiming
Yeah.
your heritage, right? But I understand that a lot of people who are really interested in this are people with no connection to any Native community, and maybe in your case to Mexico either. So I was wondering, first of all, I was wondering if you have examples of people without any of these connections who still want to participate in the danza and all that. And also how does that, what should I say, influence the movement overall to have people who are really, really interested, and I imagine very much sort of into it and really want to learn, but who have no real ties to those communities to begin with.
Yeah, thank you. This is so complex, and it's something that has taken me a long time to try to solve in my head, but it's something that I feel it doesn't have a right answer either. But like we have two different layers, right? For Mexican people, we're talking about people where, and I don't have this in the talk, but during the colonial times, there was like a caste system, and like depending on like if you were like the kid of like, let's say someone is Spanish and someone indigenous, you would be a mestizo. If you were the kid of someone indigenous and someone mestizo, you're a castizo. And it's like all these layers of like racial classifications at the end of the day that were actually very flexible. And people move throughout castes also, depending on how they looked and depending on the level of Western culture that they had. So the more Western culture you acquired, even if you look indigenous, you were able to claim to be mestizo or to be castizo, and like that will give you more access to things in society, right? Like this is like 16th century. So the process of acculturation in Mexico and the process of de-Indianization, of making people more mestizo, less indigenous, was very quick. And even today, it can take a couple of generations. And some people would not identify as indigenous people, even though they lived all their lives in an indigenous community after they go to the university, for example. If they go to the university, they acquire like a high level of Westernization, a different level of like Spanish literacy, etc. And then they stop identifying as indigenous. So like then what happens to their kids? Like they're going to be removed from indigenous culture, but are they indigenous or are they no indigenous? Like it's so complex, right? And then on the other side, there are people that are not Mexican, that are not indigenous, that want to practice these traditions. And some of the teachers from Toltec and Aztec revitalization movements allow this because and this is where the word religion comes in handy as well, because then it becomes a religious practice. It doesn't become something that is cultural appropriation for some of them. For others, it's very complex. For some groups, it's going to be cultural appropriation, and for some groups, it's going to be practicing a religion, and they're going to welcome people from the outside. And in the group I work with, there were people from other ethnicities that were practicing dance, and that they were being welcomed and allowed to be part of the ritual, the ceremony, and all of these things. There was a girl that was from Afghanistan. There was a person that was Native American. There was a girl from Russia. There was another person that was mixed race, biracial, Native American and Black. So it happens. Like there are people, there's white people sometimes too. There are people coming and practicing And they always have the permission of the teacher, that I think that's like the tricky part, or the right? Yeah. It's very complex. I don't know what's going to happen in a few years. I'm curious to see, because it's evolving all the time.
Any other questions? Okay, is there anything in the chat here? I don't know if we...
I don't think so.
It says thank you.
I was very
I-
nervous about the time, and I went really fast, so I apologize for that. I'm seeing now we have like extra time, so.
I do have a question about your future work, Anita. I'm sorry, I came in late, so this is going to be a little bit broad, but I was wondering if you had noticed any trends in popular literature with regard to genre yet. I'm not sure like how far into the research you are, but I was wondering how genre and like categorization are playing into those texts, if at all. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's why this is so interesting to me to start doing, because there's not a genre. People have not classified this type of literatures yet, and I think they need to be classified. I want to do it. I want to be that person, but you guys are welcome to do it too if you have time, and you're doing like a research project as grad students. This is so interesting, and there's so much that you can add and explore, and it doesn't have to be just like, because the examples that I'm putting here are like Mexico and the US. I want to create that connection because specifically all these examples are talking about Toltec and Aztec revitalizations or Toltec and Aztec culture, but this has happened also in other places in Latin America. There's like some literature in Peru. I have a book that I have not been able to read yet, but that I found in a used bookstore in Quito about a shaman in the Amazons that is teaching kind of like a mestizo that came to the Amazons, the ways of the Amazonian Indians. So it's rich. There's a lot, and yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. And I have my master's thesis is all on this book of Regina, 2 de octubre no se olvida, from Antonio Velasco Piña. It's all in Spanish. So if you read Spanish, you have access to my thesis. But an example is that this novel is being classified with all the novels that talk about the student movement and the student massacre in Mexico of 1968, even though it's talking about a spiritual movement, not a political movement. So it's interesting to see that too.
Anything else? Well, this is maybe a little outside what you're talking about, but I find it really interesting how sort of things that like books and also movies and popular culture can really change how people look at their own past, right? I mean, this is across that they can have enormous influence on how we construct ourselves as beings simply just by tapping into these sort of sources of popular culture that can become incredibly important.
Yes. This is absolutely what I'm going to try to do as my future research, and that is connected to my master's research, because what we see usually is like people that study literature or popular culture, they are seeing how the reality is creating these, or is producing, right, like these things. And what I saw with the book of Regina was exactly the opposite. It is a novel that is creating a spiritual movement. And what I'm trying to argue as well with all this new literature is that, separate from like self-help literature, that we will see like it's like targeting the individual, right? And changing how the individual thinks. This type of literature is talking about and creating changes in the collective level. So it's creating spiritual groups, it's creating reading groups, or groups that create like rituals around it, etc. So for me, that's very interesting because it's another level of engagement when it's able to create a new community through a narrative.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, you know, I'm from Denmark, as I told you, and so in recent years, there's been all this stuff about Vikings, movies, books, and all that stuff. And so people are getting these whole new ideas about, you know, our own sort of heritage from Vikings that,
Yes.
you know, that really, if you go just 10 years back, didn't really exist. But now, and their groups were sort of, you know, practicing, you know, so-called what they think of Viking rituals and things like that. And it's just really interesting how the impact of these, you know, these sort of relatively recent sources have on people's perception of themselves.
That's so interesting. And I wonder if, because for Toltec and Aztec revitalizations, what we also see is like things, especially with danza, there's like a purification process.
Mm-hmm.
So the more we see like danza advancing in time, the more people say, oh, but before, like last 10 years, it's been done wrong. You need to change all of these things to make it more, they don't say authentic, but to make it closer to what our ancestors did. So like, yeah, it's like through the study of history that they are also changing and generating these things.
Very interesting.
Yeah, I wonder if
action to.
yeah.
That's okay. Any other questions? Well, and then I think we should thank Lisa very much for this really interesting presentation, and it's great that you could take time off to come and talk to us, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. I really enjoy having this conversation and being here. Please feel free to email me if you have any further questions. I muted myself. Yeah, I was trying to open the chat. Or if you want to just stay in touch, if you have further questions, talk about these topics, I'm putting my personal email there because